morning, everyone. As I just introduced myself, I'm Cairns. I'm a researcher from Portugal. I work mainly in the area of youth mobility. I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes or so about youth mobility. I'm not going to do too much kind of serious academic talks, so there won't be any kind of tables or statistics or any kind of analysis. You can obviously talk with me about that later. So I'm just going to generally introduce the subject of youth mobility, talk about some of the important issues, and I have an assistant here to So I will just begin with a very obvious question. What is youth mobility? Well, this is a very broad area in respect to the geographical movement of young people. There is no one privileged area. For example, transnational and interregional mobility are equally important. Likewise, being able to be mobile within your own society, your own community is vitally important. Equally as significant as the capacity to be transnationally mobile within your work and study life. So youth mobility is a very, very broad area. It encompasses various forms of movement, various durations of movement, your short-term mobility and more or less permanent moves. And mobility is basically for, I've written almost everyone. So in terms of access to mobility, this is something that should apply to the vast majority of young people across Europe. It should not be restricted to a small minority. And from my own perspective, I see youth mobility is very much a mainstream issue. So it's not a kind of niche subject, but rather something that I think we can all find some relevance in. Okay, so first of all, what do we know about youth mobility? Well, I think the immediate answer is not enough.
For a computer, it's
So I would say that from the academic perspective, youth mobility is a seriously under-researched subject, which is surprising considering that it is of such broad significance. There's very little serious statistical evidence. Not so much in terms of in-depth study. I mean, the one area would be Erasmus. I mean, there are a lot of studies of Erasmus, but in terms of more individually mediated youth mobility, I mean, I'm one of the very few people who actually do research in this. I mean, there are a growing number of people, I'm very pleased to say, who are looking at youth mobility, but it's still, in academic terms, a minority interest. I think one reason for this is methodological issues. Like I said, there's basic lack of data. So from the migration studies point of view, where quantitative methods dominate, it's very difficult to focus on young people. And from a kind of a youth researcher point of view, it's very difficult to study something which is missing, or to study a group of young people who aren't there. Because if you want to study young people who are mobile in your society, I mean, how do you find people who've gone? So it's a very kind of tricky area to grasp because of the lack of evidence and because of the difficulty in actually finding mobile young people. And in terms of I mean, there is no theory of youth mobility. So I can't kind of put up a nice little model and say, well, yes, this is why people move. I mean, I can talk about some important aspects that influence mobility decision making, but really methodologically problematic and theoretically underdeveloped. But what I can tell you is that practically every study I've ever done on young people, mobility and other themes, I find a very, very high level of interest in being mobile, especially for work and especially for study. I'm really delighted that we have not only a policy perspective to follow, but also someone from a work point of view, because mobility tends to be stereotyped as a kind of leisure activity, but for many young people it's quite a serious thing, especially for young people who live in more geographically peripheral societies. I mean, most of my own work has been conducted in Ireland and in Portugal, which are two relatively remote societies in terms of not being in the center of Europe. And perhaps mobility is less urgent for young people in the major metropolitan centers. But for young people in countries like Ireland and Portugal, it's a very normal thing to want to move in terms of there being mobility requirements because of the lack of local opportunities. So, like I said, very high level of interest, but the actual level of substantial geographical movement appears to be very low. Like I said, we don't really have serious statistics in this, but certainly it is a minority experience in terms of the actual number of young people who move, say, for more than a year. So it's a majority, it's an issue of majority interest, but in terms of the take-up mobility, it's very much a minority of young people who do this. So why does youth mobility matter? Why should we be concerned with the lack of mobility of young people? Well, for young people themselves, there are some very important issues, as well as kind of more obvious economic imperatives, and also being able to develop your educational future. So there are some pretty basic imperatives for wanting to be mobile, to kind of further develop your career, your educational profile, and as well as a person, to experience other cultures. For society, there are also some serious demographic factors, because in Europe we have an aging population, and young people are basically going to be increasingly bearing the burden for supporting this aging population. So as older people become unable to support themselves, younger people have to take up this responsibility, and they have to develop careers that allow them to contribute to society. So there's a kind of serious point to youth mobility. And also there's an issue which I've mentioned here about social inequality, because traditionally youth mobility has been a kind of elite pursuit. Historically, the children of the rich would go on a grand tour across Europe and spend months or even years visiting countries. And today, I mean, there's still a kind of remnant of this still exists in terms of the most mobile young people tend to be the most well-off young people. So I think there is an imperative for us to widen access to youth mobility, to not have it as just an elite preserve. Okay. Now, very briefly, I want to mention some of the political implications of youth mobility. At national levels, youth mobility tends to be regarded as politically embarrassing. If you are in a country and all your young people leave or want to leave, it's not seen as a good sign. And in fact, there have been a few kind of incidents in Portugal recently where government ministers have kind of, in an unguarded moment, have kind of said things like, "Oh, I wish our young people would all move to Angola," And this kind of thing does not go down well. I mean, having your young people leave is seen as a kind of a sign of backwardness or a political failure. And this is especially true of highly skilled and tertiary educated young people. I mean, you do not want to lose people who you've invested a lot of money in terms of their education. So perhaps this helps explain why governments don't do more to encourage youth mobility, because they don't want their best and brightest young people to move. At international level, well, there's certainly a lot of rhetoric. There's a lot of talk about mobility. I'm not so sure about actual measures. I mean, there obviously there are policies, but what about actual measures? I mean, I know that in terms of institutional factors, there's been a huge amount of progress in fostering a higher level of mobility, and that is extremely important, but that is a prerequisite. I mean, there's still a lot to be done at individual level to help people be mobile. And of course, there are also kind of issues regarding brain drain, brain circulation, brain waste. So I think there is a kind of fear of if you encourage young people to move, that will be detrimental to your country's development. So perhaps the political reticence is due to some kind of fears about having a mass youth exodus for some reason. There are also issues related to not only the quantity of young people leaving, but the quality. So if certain key individuals leave, it could cause a problem. I mean, we're seeing a situation at the minute in Portugal where, because of the economic crisis, because we have these, even in universities, because we have these ridiculous salary cuts, the first thing that happens is the best people leave. So we kind of have that kind of, the impact tends to be exaggerated because when you cut investment to education, some of the people who leave are the people who were bringing in investment. So the actual quality, or even losing a small number of young people or older people who have particular skills, particular valuable skills, can be a significant political issue. So that is, I'm sure we'll be hearing more about policy issues. I don't really want to talk about too much because it's not my specialist area. But just in terms of wrapping up my presentation, I want to talk about some of the possible barriers as well as the bridges to mobility. My own research, which is mostly with tertiary educated and university level young people, in the kind of 18 to 20, 24, 25 age group. I would say the main finding of my research is that the most important mobility agent, it's not the government, it's not the Council of Europe, it's not the European Commission, it's the family. And what's interesting about this is that in terms of encouraging mobility, the family is the most important agent, but also in terms of discouraging mobility, again, the family is the most important agent. So I don't know how this translates into other societies, but certainly in Ireland and in Portugal, if you want to understand youth mobility, you've got to understand the family. Secondly, kind of peer relationships and community attachment are also important. Again, this works both ways. I mean, if you have friends living in other countries, that can be a very important asset in terms of helping you to be mobile, and it also provides a kind of mobility role model. But if you have a lot of locally based friendships, or people who are strongly attached to the local communities, this can make it much more difficult to move. And this is why I said at the very beginning, mobility is for almost everyone. Well, there are some people, it just wouldn't be practical for them to be mobile because their lives are completely locally based. In terms of in terms of the policy level, like I said, there's been obvious improvement in respect to removing some of the legal barriers to movement, but many bureaucratic problems remain. I mean, if you are a mobile person yourself, you will know this. In terms of every country has its own kind of welfare systems and national insurance, every pensions. If you're going to move for a substantial period of time, it can be quite complicated. And there are a lot of kind of hidden barriers still there if you want to move to a particular country. So while things like in education, for example, especially tertiary education, we've seen a lot of developments which have helped to improve the mobility potential. There are still kind of other institutional factors which can put people off moving or prevent people moving. There's an ongoing issue of language. This is especially true of English language or English speaking societies, where I don't know if it's just arrogance because they think the rest of the world speaks English, they don't need to bother learning the language, or it's just not a priority within schools for people to learn languages. But in terms of research in Ireland, I mean, this is a very strong issue because people feel they can only move to an English-speaking society because they either can't or won't learn another language. But also I find that in Portugal, people want to move to an English-speaking society because it's perceived as more accessible. So certainly there needs to be a big improvement in terms of foreign language learning. That is a major barrier to movement. And more recently, we've seen the economic crisis in many countries in Europe. I think if you kind of based your perceptions of society on what you read in the local media, you would probably think, oh, economic crisis, lots of young people are going to leave, go abroad looking for work. This isn't really happening, not yet anyway. And in fact, what I've actually found is the economic crisis is preventing people from moving because being mobile costs. There's an economic cost, there is an emotional cost as well, of course. And if your resources are being depleted by the economic crisis and the austerity measures, this is going to reduce your potential to finance a move. So what I'm actually finding, especially among Portuguese young people, is that while the desire to leave is being stimulated, the actual capacity to leave is being degraded by the economic crisis. So that is something that we really need to think about because there is obviously the disparity between the desire to move and the ability to move is if anything, wide. So just to finish off, I just wanted to ask a few questions. So first of all, are policymakers doing a good job of encouraging youth mobility? I don't know. Does anyone have the answer? I'm sure we have policy people here. Yeah.
Morale statistiek, dat is licht op weg.
We should see, I think the main problem is when you spoke in the beginning of the presentation that there is a lack of researchers about it. And whenever there should be some base evidence, thing to create the document so that we can so that we can put some measures in it and invest money in certain areas that are needed and are great from researchers.
So it's not policymakers' fault.
No, I wouldn't say so. I think
the academics.
I can only talk from the from Croatian point of view that so far we didn't invest much in studies. I think that is the main problem. But later on in my presentation, you will hear that for this year we, as a government, as our ministry, we invested in a let's say first study after 10 or 12 years that will cover potential problems and needs of young people in migration. And I think not only those kinds of studies, but some smaller, like more focused on, for example, mobility pyramid and support of the government financially.
Okay.
So we'll hear much more about that later. Yeah?
Yes?
Well, I have a comment to your presentation, because I think you escaped rather lightly in the beginning when you refused to define youth mobility, because I think it's absolutely necessary that we, in order to come to grips with this rather amorphous term, that we try and establish some kind of taxonomy of youth mobility according to purpose, if you like. And that's especially a problem because I think that some of your conclusions, the conclusions that you made, actually, they only bear on a particular kind of youth mobility. I took notice of the fact that you said at a certain stage that youth mobility is seen as politically embarrassing. And that is only true for a specific kind of youth mobility in labor market mobility, where it's connected with issues like brain drain, all the best of a cohort, they leave the country because to look for employment elsewhere. But it's not true for what we could call learning mobility, which receives a lot of attention and where lots of efforts are made in order to promote this. And there's also a thing like recreational mobility, I mean tourism. That's also in a sense youth mobility, but is that the kind of mobility that we're interested in here? I mean, the program here speaks about to consider to support more effective youth mobility, effective in terms of what I think these issues are very important to come to grips with, and we need somehow to distinguish between various modes, if you like, forms of youth mobility when we discuss it. Otherwise, we sort of we risk mixing up things and making life more complicated for us than it actually is.
I'm going to ask us to move on because we have other speakers, so my job is to partly manage the time. You've raised massively important, interesting points, and I think we're here for today and tomorrow to really think about exactly those points. What do we mean by youth mobility? What impact are we trying to achieve in all the work we do to promote youth mobility? So you've raised the absolutely crucial points. I'm going to keep us moving just so that we have a chance to hear that perspective.
Just to briefly, in terms of learning mobility, absolutely, that is incredibly important. In regard to kind of leisure mobility, I think young people tend to do a good job of that themselves already. Actually, the first study I ever did on youth mobility was looking at various forms of mobility, and I kind of concluded that leisure mobility was the one area where young people were managing okay, and really less urgent attention was required. But in terms of the second question here about academics doing a good job, definitely not. So that's a very easy question to answer. And I think there are all kinds of, I mean, if you are familiar with how academics work, I mean, there are all kinds of reasons. I mean, I mentioned the lack of basic data, but it's kind of perceived, academics basically follow the money. And youth mobility isn't perceived as a big money earner. So until now, it's not really attracted a lot of serious academic attention. But finally, in terms of young people's own mobility expectations, well, I think certainly the level of interest is pretty massive. So I think there is a huge opportunity to address mobility in work, in study, perhaps in other forms, both between countries, within communities. So I think mobility is extremely important for the vast majority of young people, and I think the vast majority of young people are interested in being mobile, and would very much like to be more mobile. So thank you very much for your time, and I will stop now so we can continue with the next speaker.
Thank you, David. Thank you. We'll have time for questions and discussion after we hear from. What do we want to do about that? What do we think it's important to do about that? The discussion about the political sensitivities around promoting youth mobility. that was quite new for me, so I think that's important for us to explore. Family as the main agent, family as the main stimulator and obstacle for young people's mobility was interesting. Bureaucratic barriers, community attachments and the important role that they play. And you touched on shifting global trends. We're here to talk about youth mobility in Europe, but talking about young people moving to Angola from Portugal would have been unthinkable 15 years ago. But now we're talking about that as a growing phenomenon. So shifting global patterns we need to think about as well. So you've raised lots of food for thought there. Thank you very much. We're going to move on.